So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. Really pleased to have you with us. So I'm also very pleased to say that we've got David Curry from Essentra with us today, who will be taking you through Essentra's use cases of Pentera, how they covered some of the challenges that they were having, and what that now looks like now that they've been using Pentera in production for over 12 months. But before I introduce you to David, I'll just take you through a few slides to introduce Pentera, if any of you are new to Pentera, to give you an idea of what Pentera is, so that when David's explaining his use cases, you can really understand the value that he's getting from that. So to introduce myself, I'm Richard Evans. I'm the regional sales manager here at Pentera. I've been here for 3 years, or just coming up to 3.5 years. So what is Pentera? This slide will probably resonate with a lot of people on the call. There's lots of security vendors out there, and there's lots of different solutions that organizations are consuming. And the question is that you may have 30, 40, 50 different security controls, but how do you know how well they're actually working for you? So we see with a lot of enterprise organizations that when they have so many security controls, it's very difficult to ensure that they are fully deployed, fully configured, and all working in harmony as well. So it could be the case that you have best of breed technology. So you could have best of breed firewalls, the best of breed EDRs. But actually, if there's a gap in that one of those security controls, then that could potentially be the risk that could take you down. So Pentera, think of us as not as another security control, but actually as a solution that is testing your security controls and making sure that, as I say, they are tuned and configured and you are getting the best value out of them. And this is what Pentera looks like. So when you're running Pentera in your production environment, we are running real safe by design attacks to actually help you understand what your risk posture looks like and what the business impact of that risk is. So it might be the case that actually, as you can see in this kill chain here, anything with a broken shield is a vulnerability that Pentera has identified and then exploited. And anything with a trophy icon is the achievement that we've had from exploiting that vulnerability. So as you can see in this kill chain here, we've got three separate vulnerabilities that have been exploited. But it's very important to say that with Pentera, when we speak about vulnerabilities, we're not just looking at static vulnerabilities, which would create a CVSS, which your vulnerability scanners would find. We're also looking at what we call dynamic vulnerabilities. And dynamic vulnerabilities are anything that an attacker would be interested in to potentially exploit. So this could be things such as legacy configuration or misconfiguration, weak users, weak passwords, and as I mentioned on the last slide, weaknesses within your security controls. So as you can see here, what Pentera has done in this situation is it's used a legacy configuration, which has allowed us to capture credentials over HTTP. We've then passed those credentials to the GPU to see if they are strong credentials or if they are weak credentials, if we can crack them. And it has actually been able to crack those credentials. So straight away, you've got a vulnerability here that Pentera has proven is a real risk in your production environment that wouldn't be shown up on a vulnerability scanner, because it is very much not about the vulnerability approach, but about the exploitability approach and the impact of those exploits. So now Pentera has cracked that hash. We will go and validate those credentials to make sure they are actually valid. And then we've opened a remote control channel, and eventually we've been able to execute some code on the host. And then very importantly, at this stage, we would absolutely expect your AV, your EDR to kick in and block us and to report that to your SOC. But in this instance, it hasn't done so. Because it hasn't done so, that's allowed us to establish a connection with Pentera, and eventually we've been able to gather valuable information from the host. The beauty of Pentera is that because it is running these real safe by design attacks, it will go and identify these weaknesses all the time. And with the fact of the AV not blocking, it's something we see regularly, and it's very rarely down to the actual capability of the antivirus or the EDR solution. It is more often than not the fact that someone has switched it off. We had a use case recently where someone wanted to install an application on the domain controller. They switched off the EDR to do so, simply forgot to switch it back on, and there's a very obvious gap in the environment there. Pentera identified that by exploiting that vulnerability and proved that actually the EDR wasn't working. A very simple fix to then go and switch that EDR on and configure it. But unless you're testing in your production environment on a continuous basis, very hard to find out these things. And something that we hear from customers a lot is that a big challenge is just regarding limited visibility. So Environments now more than ever, particularly with cloud environments, are constantly changing, and therefore the attack surface is constantly changing. And I think most organizations have an acceptable risk level that they want to work to. But every time that change is happening, that might then tip the risk level above what they would find acceptable. So if you are having new hosts in the networks, or there's new cyber threats out there in the wild, or you're deploying new cloud instances or making policy changes, every time you're doing these, your risk level is changing. And if you're only testing your environment on a once per annum, per quarter basis with manual penetration testing, then it could be a long while until you find that risk. And with Pentera, you can continuously just check, okay, great, what new risk has been introduced? So you can have Pentera on a schedule, which I'll show in a couple of slides' time, but then you can also run ad hoc tests. So if you are deploying a new security control, you can test it straight away and make sure that that configuration is actually working as you expect it to be doing so. And this here is a great way of demonstrating this. So this is a slide that one of our customers very kindly gave to us. And it shows a very typical, and this was their case, a very typical penetration testing cadence. So they were having a once per annum penetration test with humans that were coming in on a 2-week engagement. And although it's great, and of course it's very necessary, there were some obvious limitations with this. The very obvious one being, what happens if you make changes to the environment on the 17th of February that has introduced risk? Are you then waiting a full year until you catch that risk? Of course, when you're doing manual testing as well, you are very reliant on the skill level of the human that's coming in, and that can vary quite significantly. And then another thing we hear is that if it takes 2 to 3 weeks for the reports to come out from the manual test, and there's a huge amount of remediation work to do, then to tackle that remediation work can be very challenging, and it can eventually drop down the list of how important it is to you because there's other things to do. And even if you do make some of those changes, how do you validate that those changes have actually worked and closed down the gaps for you? And this is what their penetration testing cadence looks like with Pentera. Everything you're seeing here is an automated schedule of tests they've got set up. So as you can see, they're running black box tests on a 2-week engagement once every other month. They're running dedicated ransomware exercises. They're also doing grey box testing. So they're giving Pentera a bit of a foot up and giving us some user credentials, just regular domain user credentials, to understand, okay, if someone in finance is spearphished, or someone in HR is as their credentials are leaked out there on the dark web, what does the blast radius look like for us then? They should only have a certain level of privilege, but actually, are they overprivileged? And the attack service starts to look a lot more significant than maybe it should do. So again, with this view, it now means that they can just test as regularly as they want. And if they are making some significant changes to the environment, then they can just set up an ad hoc test as well to go and test that at any time they want. Beauty with Pentera is once you're licensed, you are completely unrestricted with how much you test. So you can test up to 75,000 endpoints every day without orchestration. And yeah, just continuously test what the environment looks like. And to give you an idea of what Pentera is doing, so really important here, some real USPs with Pentera is we're running real attacks in production. It is completely safe by design, but they are real attacks. We're not running playbooked attacks. So Pentera is working on an algorithm-based attack. So it's saying, if I found and exploited this vulnerability, I now know as an attacker, here's potentially 10 different options I have to go and explore. And Pentera will systematically work through all of them options to see how far it can advance an attack. So very important to mention as well is that Pentera is an agentless solution, and it's something that David saw a lot of value in from the proof of value and in production as well. So I'm sure he'll take you through that. But the idea is, if you're looking at your on-premise environments, you simply just give Pentera an IP range or IP ranges that you want to test. And then Pentera will start with that network recon to identify all of the assets that are live within the environment. And throughout my years at Pentera, we've seen some weird and wonderful things that have been found that have presented a risk. My favorite story to date is a drinks machine that was plugged into the network that had a server on it that ordered drinks when it was running low. Highly vulnerable server, Pentera use that as a foothold of the attack, and eventually from exploiting that server, could close out 97 conveyor belts in a logistics firm. So that agentless approach really going to go and find that shadow IT for you, those unknown unknowns risks that you may not be aware of. And then once we've done that recon, we'll build up a picture of all of the vulnerabilities. But as I mentioned, it's not necessarily just static vulnerabilities, but it's anything that an attacker's going to be interested in that they could potentially exploit. And then once we've got that, we start to go through that cycle of dynamically exploiting these vulnerabilities to see what your true risk is. We'll then start to sniff credentials, and if we manage to sniff any credentials, try and crack those credentials, then we get into the really interesting stuff. Can we inject malware? Can we start to relay those credentials, potentially only even with a hash? Can we start to exfiltrate data or start to encrypt some files, all the way through to that full end-to-end ransomware attack? Again, really just proving out the point of what your risk posture looks like, not based on what you think it looks like, but actually based on what an attacker could exploit. And to take you through the Pentera platform, so I just described our on-premise environment there, but we have Pentera Core, which is looking at your on-premise environments, so Windows, Linux, Macs. And we then have the cloud product, which is looking at anything of all of your cloud native environments. So do you have any data, identities, or workloads that an attacker could potentially find and exploit? And then Surface is looking externally. What can an attacker see from you from Timbuktu? Do you have any lost or forgotten assets that therefore may be unpatched, unmanaged, and ultimately vulnerable? But with all of these products, we are going through that process of not just finding the vulnerabilities, but actually acting like the attacker in your production environment and dynamically exploiting these vulnerabilities, going through the kill chain to show you just how far an attacker can get. And then very pleased to introduce our newest product, which is Pentera Resolve, which is AI-based vulnerability prioritization, pulling in feeds and integrating with over 100 different security vendors so that you can now start to see that not only what can Pentera exploit, but also what vulnerabilities is your EDR solution finding, what vulnerabilities is your vulnerability management solution, your CSPM solutions, all the way from code, all the way through to CSPM, to then give you that single view of what your world actually looks like from a vulnerability and an exploitability perspective, and then automatically creating and assigning tickets so that within the CTEM, the continuous threat exposure management platform, it's not just looking at the scoping and the prioritization, it's also going through to the mobilization as well to actually fix those vulnerabilities that you're identifying. And of course, wouldn't be a webinar without taking you through some of the customers we work with. So Pentera does work with a lot of enterprise customers. We have over 1,300 customers that are using Pentera in their production environment day in, day out. And that goes from some of the largest organizations in the world all the way down to small colleges. So if you think about BlackRock and Blackstone, the two largest private equity firms globally, we have two of the largest 10 banks in the world that are using Pentera on a continuous basis. Retail, manufacturing, all organizations are facing the same challenge, and that is actually understanding what their risk posture looks like from an attacker's perspective. And now I'm very pleased to introduce you to David. David was equally unhappy with the size of his picture on this slide. But yeah, David, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your inputs and looking forward to hearing a bit about one, how you evaluated Pentera, and then two, how you've seen Pentera add some value in your production environment.
Yeah, hi all. So yeah, Dave Curry, Director of Cybersecurity and IT Infrastructure at Essentra. Essentra is a global manufacturing firm. Don't worry, I won't read through all the bits on this slide, but we basically manufacture and distribute small plastic and metal parts, mainly to people who are manufacturing other things. So chances are the desk you're sat at has three of our parts in it. Your car's got 10, 15, your EV charger, whatever it may be. The handles on your server cabinet probably have some of our parts in or maybe manufactured by us. I think like most manufacturers, we have quite a complex footprint. We tend to grow through acquisition, which makes it a challenge from a vulnerability point of view, footprint point of view. And, again, like most manufacturers, a reasonable amount of legacy systems. And, that OT space, Rich obviously mentioned the drinks machine. We do have a lot of weird and wonderful stuff plugged into our network that we do need to understand. And I guess, again, like the whole manufacturing sector, it is the most attacked sector from a cybersecurity risk point of view. So we do take cybersecurity very, very seriously. If you don't mind going on to the next slide, Rich.
Great. Thanks, David. Yeah, great. And yeah, it'd be awesome if you could just tell us a bit about your role at Pentera and sorry, at Essentra, and also the team around you.
I thought you were offering me a job there, Rich. I never move. You can see I've been at Essentra for 20 years. So yeah, joined Essentra in the early 2000s. I joke that I've done most of the jobs in IT at this point, but it's probably not too far off. I moved into cybersecurity back in 2018, mainly from a identity perspective. Um, we've seen a vast amount of change over the last few years. So, so I think I was in cybersecurity for a few years. 2022 was when I became sort of head of and took over overall responsibility for cybersecurity. At the time, we were going through a massive separation. So we were with three manufacturing divisions. We were selling off two of those. And at the same time, we were going through quite a bit of technical change. So we'd managed to secure Microsoft E5 licenses. We're moving away from a legacy Trellix installation, and we're also changing some of our other key tooling, like our microsegmentation products. More recently, I have taken overall responsibility for infrastructure and network. So it does, from a vulnerability management point of view, and actually driving the value from what we get from Pentera. I am in a really good position to force the relevant changes through. From a cybersecurity point of view, we've got a six-member team split between the UK and India. And we are augmented by an external MDR partner. I'll come on to that at the moment, but that was one of the other motivators for looking for tooling in this space.
Great.
Next slide, please, Rich.
Brilliant. Thanks. Yeah. And when we was initially speaking with David before we came into a proof of value, there was obviously some obvious pain points that we were looking to address. And we were having a conversation with David recently and just discussing those again. And I think these were the key ones that we were really looking to address with Pentera. So David, yeah, I'd love just to hear a few thoughts from you about some of these pain points and yeah, what they were actually causing you.
Yeah, I think, so starting with that lack of visibility, I mentioned we were going through vast change at the time. And I think, continued complex sort of footprint side of things. I mentioned before, we are a manufacturing firm that tend to install a lot of equipment. I wouldn't say we have the best network access controls always. We're not always engaged on things being connected into our networks, etc. And really on that acquisition front as well, we don't necessarily have a good picture of what our attack surface looks like. So that was, one of the key drivers for me to start to explore technology in this space. From a vulnerability prioritization point of view, we, like everyone, we run the vulnerability scans, we have the penetration tests, etc. Actually, from both pen tests and some real world incidents, I guess we'd seen some weaknesses in our approach, much as everyone jumps to address those, 8 out of 10 CVS vulnerabilities. It was we'd had pen tests where actually, you loop together a 3, a 6, and a 7, and actually you managed to get to the main admin, etc. So I think there was a concern that we were missing some of that, but also, again, with that complex environment faced with pages and pages of vulnerabilities, where do we target our time and effort? There is always those challenges in manufacturing. There's some legacy stuff, there's stuff you can't patch. So really, understanding what we should be doing and getting the most bang for our buck out of those efforts. Mentioned, the mergers and acquisitions piece that, that's a real challenge for us. We tend to buy relatively small businesses. So due diligence is quite difficult. You're asking, potentially family firms to answer a load of really complex questions. Again, historically, we were sort of running a vulnerability scanner once we could in the site, trying to get some sort of level of visibility, not necessarily giving us the best view of what actually needed to be actioned. So we really wanted a better approach for assessing those, not only before acquisition, but after we bought them for, what's their security posture like? Is there anything we need to do immediately? And certainly before integrating them into our network.
Just on that point then, David. So when you were going through a merger or an acquisition more so, um, prior to Pentera or even with Pentera, it'd be great to understand. Did you have a period of time that you would try to standardize their security controls with you mentioning that they were often small organizations, sometimes family-run firms? I guess there was a lot of the case where actually the security controls were barely non-existent or low level.
Yeah, and it's a real variety, and I think that's one of the areas Pentera has helped us in massively is you would assess an acquisition, and some of them had what appeared to be good security controls, good tooling. Some others, we found some weird and wacky EDR or antivirus providers or whatever else that I'd never even heard of, to be perfectly honest. And I think being able to actually run scans that can assess the strength of those really helps us make decisions. Previously we've had integrations that we've probably rushed through and take decisions that in hindsight we wouldn't have, but the security tooling was viewed as being at such a low level, we had to take those steps, and that's produce support challenges or whatever else. So it does give us a much clearer view of, okay, this is how well they're protected against these things. This is how well it's been detected. And allows us to make more surgical decisions of actually, okay, well, if we replace tool X, Y, and Z, or actually if we deal with this set of vulnerabilities, we can tolerate that tooling for a longer period of time.
Great. Awesome.
Proof to management, I think, this was something I get more and more, to be perfectly honest, and certainly with the high profile attacks we've had this year, but especially our non-exec directors, I will get regular questions around, okay, this other company I work with have been hit by ransomware group X, how would we be from a posture point of view? What would happen if they attacked us? That was a really difficult question to answer. And I think, one of the real advantages we have seen from Pentera, Rich showed all those different test types in the calendar. And one of them is that ransomware emulation. So, I think it's 5, maybe even more families of ransomware that you can test in a perfectly safe manner. And that was, really valuable for me to be able to go, okay, well, actually, I'm not just answering the question and giving you an opinion. Here's a report of this is where we run it against site X, and here is the results. So that was hugely valuable. I mentioned the MDR implementation. That was a new piece that we're doing. I mentioned, us separating out. We were shrinking as a team. We needed that MDR partnership to ensure that we had 24/7 coverage. But, you go through that RFP process, you sort of make the agreement. How do you reliably test that, mean time to detect, mean time to respond are absolutely there, and that you are, consistently detecting those attacks, and you're comfortable you have got the coverage you're expecting from that.
I think
User
that's a really sorry, Dave, to jump in. I think that's a really interesting point. So pleased to say, not the case with when we came in to see you for the proof of value, but I think we've obviously spoken about exploiting vulnerabilities and the actually validating security controls. But a really interesting use case actually that you just reminded me is the actually validating security services as well. So anyone that's a service provider, you with SOC is a great example. How you're paying these external SOC providers a lot of money to actually respond in a rapid way. But how do you know how well they're responding? And it's not the case of a blame game, but it is you can really use Pentera to help refine that as well. So you can test on a regular cadence. Sometimes the SOC may know that you're going to run a test. Other times they may not. It's almost in a fire drill type way. So that on the days they know you are testing them, they can they can really understand what visibility they're seeing and maybe what lack of visibility they're seeing. On the days when they're not expecting you to test, then it's great just to see that actually those playbooks we've put in place previously following the fire drill attempts has that improved their response time. And we've seen whole days where we've successfully completed ransomware attacks from all the way from a black box and they've not heard from the SOC. And then we've seen the other extreme where within 2 minutes of Pentera being on the network, they're seeing us and they're reporting back. So it's really important to go and validate those services as well.
Yep. User credential strength. So I mentioned I'm from an identity background, so it's one of my pet peeves is the weak passwords. We spend a hell of a lot of time doing awareness training around passphrases, etc. We did we're doing at the time some very manual checks on duplicate passwords, which was a huge amount of effort for the team. And then, we were getting to the regular pen tests that we're paying for, and suddenly you'd get to the bottom and find a list of credentials where people, much as they'd stuck to the technical aspects of the password policy, actually what they were setting was not suitable, and they were managing to get through passwords that were still, easily crackable. And then I think finally, I mentioned that level of technical change really as we were moving EDR, moving microsegmentation, etc. I wanted to make sure that we're moving to something that was more secure, but obviously, again, implementing a new tool, understanding some of those challenges, making sure it's consistently blocking what it needs to block. And then, on an ongoing basis, when you're putting in exceptions, as you're modifying things, as you're sort of refining controls, just making sure that you're understand what your posture is, but also having some useful input into posture changes you should be making.
Great. Really appreciate that. Yeah, they're very regular pain points that we hear from a lot of customers as well. So yeah, then just moving on to how automated security validation with Pentera has helped you in those.
Yeah, so I think that, the continuous visibility piece, we were very much in that sort of situation you highlighted in the calendar of, yeah, we were secure on February the 9th, but I couldn't tell you from there on inwards, especially with all the change we were going through as well, a real need to view that, get an understanding of that. So we are, I can provide management with a regular risk score from you guys for every site that we look after. I think, one of the points that you mentioned earlier on, which I think was as we started to run these scans, was something that we really saw was, staff, I've put in a test system temporarily to deal with this problem, or
Yeah.
we've been fixing a problem with system X and we've done this temporary workaround and fix. And actually you're running these scans, and a scan that was an A or a B the previous month, you're running it again and suddenly it's a D, and it's just not something that you would have picked up with the tooling that we had at the time, not something we had visibility of. And, we wouldn't have closed that until an annual pen test on site or whatever it was. So being able to get that visibility and that understanding, I've had some quite challenging conversations with members of our teams, but finding that stuff before an attacker does, look, is, from a value from the tool point of view, has been absolutely superb from us. That automated prioritization, I think, from our side, like I say, it's always a challenge to prioritize the vulnerabilities, and there is stuff that we can't patch, we can't deal with. I think being able again to provide reports to the teams to say, okay, well, this is the biggest bang for the buck stuff that we can fix for site X or for system X, Y, and Z. But I think also that kill chain piece, so that bit Rich showed at the start, where you can see the full kill chain, where you can't fix a certain vulnerability, being able to actually use a different option and look through, okay, well, we can do this with our EDR, or we can make this other change here. And, you can, within the tool, you can simulate, you can click on one of those and say, okay, well, if we fix this, where would that attack chain get to? I think, that's been really helpful for those sort of monthly vulnerability calls that we have to say, okay, well, if we can't address this for 2 months, then can we do this? Can we do X, Y, and Z? I think, that's been phenomenal. in terms of M&A, so we have sort of our main installation of Pentera, but we then also have it on a laptop. So we will take that out to sites that we purchase, plug it in, and within a day and a half. I mean, we to be perfectly honest, run a very similar thing to what you did, Rich, when you and the guys turned up to site here to run a proof of value. So it was very much okay, what can we see from a vulnerability attacker point of view, and also let's have a look at their Active Directory password strength, etc. Gives us a really clear view. And I think one of the other advantages with that, I mentioned we're buying, sometimes family run businesses, etc. Giving them a list of stuff from a traditional vulnerability scanner and saying, you need to go out and sort all of this, compared to, okay, well, here's a report, here's the critical stuff, and actually, using your guys' wiki technology to say, okay, well, actually, here's the solution. This is the stuff that you need to step through before we can look to integrate networks or whatever else. And then, like I say, being able to make those more surgical decisions on, actually, is their security tooling up to scratch? How quickly do we need to drive change in this space, and where should we target that expenditure?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I think a word that we hear a lot is context. As you say, if you go into a family-run business and say, here's 1,000 vulnerabilities that you've got, it is very hard to do anything with. But if you can actually say, well, actually, we've just, and this isn't the case, people on the call, but David's gone in and cracked a CEO's password, then there is that evidence base there, and it can really hit home that these are your priorities to go and fix.
um, Yeah, and I think actually just to mention one thing I do really like about that password piece as well, much as it's probably the most irritating scan for me from my mood point of view, because I get the report and there's always something there. But actually, the fact that you can go in and see what those passwords are, I think allows you to have a conversation. You'll quite often get the feedback of, okay, well, I don't know how you've cracked my password because it's really strong. So you can actually have that conversation of, okay, well, this was your password. These are the reasons why it's not strong, why it doesn't fit with policy. So I think it really helps to do that re-education piece. And I think I've had a few phone calls from people saying, there's no way you've managed to crack my password, and being able to just go, well, it's X, Y, and Z. And
Yeah.
actually, do you want me to go and find out whether you're using that on the internet anywhere as well? From a password reuse point of view, I think it shocks staff into sort of modifying their behaviours in that space. Really useful.
Great.
I skipped to point five, I guess, from a SOC validation, that MDR partnership that we got. It has helped us validate that. It's quite interesting. We have all the alerts now, so when we are running a scan, we inform them so they know, but they still send through all of the relevant information. There are options there to speak to with your MDR partner. You can sign the attack so that you can, get them to completely isolate them out. We prefer to sort of keep it up, make sure that they are getting that visibility on a regular basis. There have unfortunately been issues where my team haven't necessarily let them know that we're running a test. So we have had some extra validations of them, which I haven't necessarily appreciated when I've had a ring from my MDR team in the middle of the night. But it does really give you that confidence. It's really good to see as well. Being able to pick through exactly what your EDR has picked up, and probably more importantly, which bits it hasn't, and doing that refining, like you mentioned, working through the playbooks with the third party just to make sure we're in the best shape we possibly can be. Um, I've probably already covered really that ongoing verification of control configuration, but that is again a key point for us is if those scores are changing on a regular basis, is it vulnerabilities or is it changes we've made in our tooling? And anytime we are making major changes to our tooling, we will run reassessments, and especially that ransomware ready piece. I think having the confidence of being able to run that on a regular basis against at least a small subset of systems, and just having that confidence that your EDR tooling is going to be there for you, or whatever it may be. I mentioned we were implementing our micro-segmentation tooling at the time, or changing from a previous vendor. Is really useful. We could run scans with it turned on, with it turned off, and actually from a sort of justifying that expenditure on that. I could say, okay, well, this is the Pentera risk score. If we run it with microsegmentation turned off, this is it with it turned on. It sort of makes the business case for the microsegmentation tooling actually, because you can really call out this is the benefit it is delivering. Um, and then yeah, I think probably final thing to call out, that proof of concept thing for me. I think we were looking at various tools at the time. Rich and the guys came to site, ran that, and there was probably actionable insights within a couple of hours, to be perfectly honest. And probably I would imagine Rich gets this a lot, but a few horrors or unexpected things, which always makes the business case internally easier to make. But from my point of view, I always think if you're buying a tool, if you can prove value within that shorter period of time, and you know that you're going to have that visibility going forwards, that was massive for me.
Great. Okay. And just on the proof of value, then, could you just maybe explain a little bit about the amount of preparation you needed, how arduous it was for you to actually prepare and then run the proof of value?
Yeah, very, very little, because I think we had a conversation the week before where I said I couldn't possibly fit it in. It was December and really busy, and we had a conversation. You were like, "No, there's very little to do," and like I say, you guys turned up with a laptop. We had to provide a few credentials in the estate, make a few exclusions, etc. It was up and running, like I say, in an hour. You guys were on site with us for the day, ran the scans, shared the results. We got to do some of the password cracking stuff as well, which was really good to see. But yeah, I think, unbelievably simple and yeah, really, really effective.
Great. Super. That wasn't a loaded question at all. Brilliant. And I appreciate, David, that you'd have covered some of the outcomes here, but if there's anything that jumps off the page for you that you'd like to cover in more detail, then it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, I think, probably, yeah, I probably won't dig into these points, but a couple of other things to mention that I've probably missed along the way, and another point that I would just make on the team. So I think, one thing for us, I probably haven't mentioned is, when you are implementing new systems, new applications, before go live, we built this into some of our change control processes. So any major changes, we're assessing it before it goes. We know we've got that confidence that we're in a good place. I think, one thing I'd really stress that's beneficial about the support that we get from Pentera and that sort of customer success and technical team is, I don't want to speculate what their bonus is based on, etc. But it's very much about us getting the most out of the tools and us getting from that calendar with a few scans to actually let's make sure we're scanning everything on a monthly basis. That's really the drive. The team are very much how do we get you from the scan cadence that you're at now to scanning everything on a more regular basis. And, we've always got that technical guidance of, okay, well, this is what we found. We don't know how to get to the bottom of this. We don't know how to address this in our estate. And that guidance is always there, which is brilliant. And I think the final point I'd make, and it probably isn't the reason you should buy tools, but I think it's a brilliant added bonus is, my cybersecurity staff work doing defensive work for a manufacturing firm. It's not necessarily the most exciting job in the world, and it's very stressful. I think the one bit they really enjoy about Pentera is it's that more fun side. It's a fun technology to use. It's a bit more interesting than a day-to-day side. It gives them that sort of chance to play the sort of pen tester or attacker a little bit. They really, really enjoy that experience. I know much as I don't thankfully get hands on with the tool, probably as much, well, my team are glad that I don't anymore. But certainly, we were at a Pentera conference a couple of years ago and you guys run a capture the flag as well. It is that entertaining that you can really genuinely, I think, enjoy using the tool, and get something out of it, not just from a, you know, your understanding of your environment and everything else. But I think it's given, our defensive teams a better understanding of how some of these attacks work, more in-depth knowledge, and that's then fed into, some of the tuning they've decided to do in our controls or our processes, our playbooks, etc. So I think it's a real added bonus.
Amazing. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, who doesn't like to be the bad guy? Play the bad guy for a little bit. You can be the attacker for the day. Um, David, look, really, really appreciate your time there. It was great to hear your insights and really appreciate you explaining just the value that Pentera's brought to your environment, to your team, and to your security posture as well. So, guys, we'll stay on the line for a couple of minutes. I can see there's a few questions already in the chat. So the first question I can see is, and David, if I could pass this to you, that would be great. Has Pentera helped identify attack paths that might have been missed from a manual penetration test?
Yeah, I think definitely, that's one of the bonuses we really see is, I can look back at all penetration reports and I've got to be honest, a pen tester quite naturally is very focused on how do I get from nothing to domain admin, and they're going to find, the first vulnerability that they can exploit there, and they're going to go that way. And so depending on how long your testing is, they're not going to explore every other use case, right? They're not going to look at that smaller stuff. So you might well get a highlight of, here's the four or five things you need to fix, but it is a more limited scope. We find a hell of a lot of that. Well, actually, this three here, that four there, etc., gets you to a much more severe situation than actually the seven or whatever else. So yeah, I think countless, and again, because of that constantly changing environment, the piece I mentioned around, yeah, we've put a temporary fix in for X, Y, and Z. You're never going to see those in a pen test, right? Or you're going to see it for a very, very short window. And I think, obviously you can pay for the pen testers to revalidate, and we often do, but just being able to do it yourself, being able to say, okay, well, the team are fixing it Wednesday, they think they fixed it. Okay, let's rerun the scan, let's target it down to just those devices, make sure it's fixed. Yeah, I think that flexibility and visibility is definitely superior for me. We don't get me wrong, we still absolutely run external pen tests, but we're able to target them a lot more on specific things that we need complex testing on, rather than them picking up stuff that, like I say, we can pick up a lot more cheaply with the tooling.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you seen the pen testers having a harder time since you've had Pentera?
Yeah, definitely. I have to say we've had some really positive pen test results this year. So touch wood, yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay, super. And just a couple more questions. One of them came in earlier, so I think you've probably addressed it, but it's how does Pentera's exploit-based validation compare to traditional CVS-based vulnerability scoring in your environment?
Yeah, like I say, I think CVS scores are brilliant, right? But it's not that attacker's eye, an attacker for me isn't just sat there going, okay, well, we'll run through this. It's what can I find? What can I see? What can I exploit? What's the easiest? And quite often what's the quietest as well, right? Like that's the approach they take. So I just think being able to get that, and mentioned about the team as well, they have a very defensive mindset and don't necessarily understand how attackers think. I think this tool acts like an attacker. You get that visibility, and I think from a confidence point of view in how safe we are from actual attacks, I probably put a lot more stall in what Pentera's telling me than what our vulnerability scanner's shown us.
Super. Great. Thanks. And then just one final question for you, David. So I'm just reading through his question. I think the question is based around are we now assuming that threats are getting in, risks are real, and everyone must be more aware of the outside is inside threats? So I take from that question there a bit about the assumed breach. So rather than assuming that no one's going to get in, these days you need to assume that someone's actually in the environment, and then looking at what that posture looks like once someone's actually inside. And I know that's the approach you take, but I don't know if there's any comments on that.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, our entire sort of tooling posture, etc., is based on assumed breach. We try to go zero trust wherever we can. So no, that's always been our view and has for many years. Sorry, just back on the previous question, because a point that I sort of completely missed that I should have called out. I guess my other view here is your vulnerability scanner is going to tell you where you've got a vulnerability. Pentera, because you've got those mitigating controls from a prioritization point of view. Okay, if you've got a vulnerability, but it's really well protected by your EDR or your segmentation or whatever else, that's less of a priority than something that isn't. I think that's, one of those other key differences for me.
Great point. Yeah, great. Super. Brilliant. So, as you would have all heard earlier, David explained a bit about the 1 day proof of value that Pentera does. So we'd love to discuss that with you. It's very, very minimal work prior to the actual proof of value. We'll come on site, me and someone much smarter than me in the engineering team will come on site, and we'll run through the full series of tests that Pentera has on offer, just to validate what your posture is looking like today and potentially identify any outliers. You'll then have the reporting at the end, and we'll do a wrap-up meeting just to take you through what's been good, what's working well in your environment, some of the potential risks you've got. So if anyone would be interested in applying for their a free 1 day proof of value, then please scan the QR code now. And yeah, we'd be delighted to have a conversation with you about it. I'll just leave that up on screen for a couple more moments. But just again to thank David so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed hearing your insights. I really appreciate the fact that you were willing to share your experience with others. So yeah, thank you very much.